Okay, picture this. You walk into your living room, and right there by the back door, you see it, a muddy paw print. And instantly, you think, oh no, the dog got in again. But think about that for a second. You're jumping to a conclusion, right? You're not seeing the dog sneak in. It's an inference. And that's what we're diving into today. This kind of reasoning, this inference to the best explanation, is called abduction. And for folks like us who love digging into the philosophical side of things, well, we're not just stopping at muddy paw prints. We're going deep, deep into when and why this kind of thinking, this abduction, actually holds water.
Absolutely. It's so intuitive, right? We do it all the time without even thinking. But the really juicy philosophical question is, when does that best explanation actually give us solid ground to believe it? You know, it's a cornerstone of so much of our reasoning. It's how we navigate everyday life and how we make scientific breakthroughs. But despite that, the philosophical debate about abduction is far from settled.
Yeah, okay. So we're talking about going beyond the evidence, right? It's not like pure logic, like deduction, where you have a rule like all prime numbers greater than 2 are odd. And then you encounter the number 7 and boom, you know for sure it's odd. No room for doubt there.
Exactly. With deduction, it's like the conclusion is baked into the premises. No surprises. But abduction, well, it shares a bit of DNA with induction, where we see a pattern and project it forward. Like, imagine you've only ever seen white swans. Hundreds of them. You might naturally start to think, hey, maybe all swans are white. Each new white swan you see just boosts your confidence in that conclusion.
Right, so induction is all about those patterns and frequencies. But abduction, it feels different. It's about making sense of something specific. Like imagine two friends, Tim and Harry. They had this big falling out, haven't spoken in ages, and suddenly you see them jogging together. Well, you wouldn't think, oh, they must both like jogging at this particular time on this particular street. You'd think they must have made up. Because that explanation, that story, just fits what you're seeing.
You've hit the nail on the head from a philosophical standpoint. Both induction and abduction, they take us beyond the evidence. But abduction is unique because it hinges on this explanatory power. Induction, it's all about the data. It's like saying, well, every apple I've ever bitten into has been sweet, so this next one will probably be sweet too. But if you say, this next apple will be sweet because that's the best explanation for why all the others were, then you've stepped into abductive territory.
Okay, so the why matters a lot. Now, I remember reading about how abduction wasn't always about this whole justification thing. Didn't it start as something about, like, coming up with new ideas?
You're right. Charles Sanders Peirce, the philosopher who really put abduction on the map, he initially saw it as this creative process, this spark of insight. It was all about generating those initial aha moments, the potential explanations. But these days, in contemporary philosophy, and especially for folks deep in philosophical thought like ourselves, the focus has shifted to abduction as a way of backing up our beliefs. It's moved from the birth of an idea to the reasons we choose to embrace it.
Got it. So it's not just about the aha, but about the, yeah, that makes sense, that comes after. And it sounds like, even though we all use abduction constantly, there's still a lot of philosophical head-scratching about whether it's a legitimate way of getting to the truth. Well, that sounds like a deep dive if I ever heard one.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We all do it, sure. But to really understand abduction philosophically, we need to get into those debates. We need to unpack what it really means to infer the best explanation and whether that's good enough for knowledge. So let's dive in, shall we?
Let's do it. So at its core, abduction is saying, hey, I see this evidence, and this particular explanation just makes the most sense out of all the possibilities, so it's probably true. Think about our examples. Tim and Harry jogging together. Sure, maybe they just happen to be there, but the simplest, most natural explanation is that they're buddies again. Or, late at night, a plate with crumbs and an empty cookie jar. The prime suspect is definitely a midnight snacker, and a trail of footprints leading to a perfectly sculpted sandcastle. Someone had to have built it on purpose. In each case, are other explanations possible? Sure, but they just don't feel nearly as convincing.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting from a philosophical perspective. Abduction, unlike that rock-solid deduction we talked about, it can change its mind. Think about Tim and Harry. Jogging together seems like they made up. Pretty solid, right? But what if you then find out they're actually in the middle of a messy lawsuit? Suddenly, that shared jog takes on a whole new meaning. Maybe they're meeting to strategize with their lawyers while getting some exercise. That new info completely changes the best explanation. Deduction never does that. A valid deductive argument, it stays valid no matter what new facts you throw at it.
It's like abduction keeps all its options open. Now, it feels like We use this kind of reasoning all the time without even realizing it. I think you even said that just believing what someone tells us can be seen as abduction.
That's right. Philosophers who study how we know things, they've pointed out that even something as basic as trusting someone's word has abductive elements. Think about it. When someone tells you something, you usually just believe them. But why? Jonathan Adler, a philosopher who's thought a lot about this, he says it's because the best explanation is that they actually believe what they're saying, and they want you to believe it too. We don't consciously think through all that every time, but it's like this underlying abductive logic is at work.
So just accepting what people say is like a mini abduction.
Yeah.
Wild. And what about language itself? Like when we're trying to figure out what someone really means?
Oh, that's a great example. Figuring out what someone means when they speak, it's totally an abductive process. Think about those unspoken rules of conversation, like the Grecian maxims. We assume people are trying to be informative, truthful, relevant, make sense. So when someone says something that seems off, we don't just take it literally. We think, okay, given these conversational rules, what's the best explanation for why they said that? And we infer a different meaning. It's all about finding the interpretation that best explains their words.
So abduction is working behind the scenes in all sorts of everyday situations. It's like the secret sauce of social interaction. But its influence goes way beyond just chatting and understanding each other, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned how it's crucial for scientific discoveries, too.
Absolutely. Many philosophers of science see abduction as this engine driving scientific progress. It's about how we discover and justify new scientific theories. Think back to the discovery of Neptune, for example. Astronomers noticed something weird. Uranus's orbit wasn't behaving quite right. They couldn't explain it based on Newton's law of gravity and all the planets they knew about. Now, did they immediately throw out Newton's theory, which had worked so well for so long? No. Instead, two brilliant minds, John Couch-Adams and Urbain Le Verrier, they independently hit on this wild idea. What if there's another planet, one we haven't seen yet, that's messing with Uranus's orbit? That was their best explanation for the weird data. And guess what? They were right. That's how we found Neptune.
That's such a cool example. It wasn't just a lucky guess. It was a calculated abductive leap. They had a puzzle, and they found the piece that fit best. Do you have another one of those aha science moments?
Oh, tons. But for a philosophical crowd, the discovery of the electron is a real gem. J.J. Thomson, he was working with these mysterious cathode rays. He saw they were being bent by electric and magnetic fields, and that bending, it pointed to something amazing. Tiny, negatively charged particles. That's what he concluded made up these rays, and he later called them electrons. Now, did he deduce that from some existing theory? No. Did he have mountains of data to back it up? Not really, but the existence of these tiny negatively charged things, it just explained his observations better than anything else. It was the best explanation, and he ran with it.
So it's like these scientists, they weren't just playing by the rules. They were proposing entirely new things to make sense of what they were seeing. That's abduction in action. It feels like this pattern is everywhere in science.
Oh, totally. Philosophers who specialize in medicine, they see it in how doctors diagnose illnesses. A doctor sees your symptoms, hears about your history, and then tries to figure out what's causing it all. They come up with different possibilities, different diagnoses, and the one that explains everything best, that's what they go with. Abduction is at work in super abstract philosophical areas, too. Like in metaphysics, when we're trying to figure out the fundamental nature of reality, or when we're talking about the meaning of if-then statements, even in the philosophy of logic itself. But for this deep dive, let's focus on where abduction really shines philosophically. In epistemology, which is all about knowledge, and in the philosophy of science, especially when we talk about underdetermination.
Underdetermination. Now, there's a word that sounds like a philosophy exam question waiting to happen.
Yeah.
It's basically saying that for any set of evidence, there could be a bunch of different explanations that all fit equally well.
Right, exactly. And that throws a real wrench into our confidence about what we know. Think about it. If multiple theories can predict the same observations, then how can we ever be sure which one is actually true? Just looking at the evidence won't tell us. It's like the classic brain in a vat thought experiment. How do you know you're not just a brain hooked up to a computer experiencing a simulated world? The skeptic will say, well, all your experiences would be the same either way.
It's a mind-bending thought, for sure. How do I know this is real? I guess that's what the skeptic wants us to grapple with. So how does abduction help with this?
Well, defenders of abduction say, hold on, even if multiple theories can fit the evidence, they're not all created equal when it comes to explaining it. Take that brain in a vat idea. It might be possible, but is it really the best explanation for our everyday experience? Probably not. The idea of a stable external world that follows the laws of physics, that's way simpler, way more coherent. Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher, he argued that we should go with the simpler explanation, even if we can't totally rule out the skeptical alternatives.
So, when the evidence itself doesn't give us a clear winner, we can look to the quality of the explanations to break the tie. It's the bestness of the explanation that tips the scales. But that makes me wonder, what makes one explanation better than another? Is there a scorecard or something?
That's the million-dollar question. Abduction might feel intuitive, but trying to pin down a precise rule, a formula for what makes an explanation best, well, that's where the philosophical rubber meets the road. The core idea is that a good explanation is more likely to be true. But how do we make that connection rigorous?
It sounds like there's no easy answer. So we're all using this best explanation idea, but there's no agreed-upon way to define what best even means.
You got it. Philosophers, they've been trying to nail down a formal definition of abduction. One common starting point, which we can call ABD1, it goes something like this. You've got some evidence, and you've got a bunch of different hypotheses that could explain it. The hypothesis that gives you the absolute best explanation, that's the one you should believe.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. What's the problem with that?
Well, for a philosophical mind, there are a few snags. First, as we've been saying, ABD1 relies on this idea of best explanation. But what does that even mean? How do we know when we found it? Usually we judge explanations based on what philosophers call theoretical virtues. Things like simplicity, how broad the explanation is, how well it fits with our other beliefs, how much it explains, and so on. But defining these virtues and figuring out which ones are more important than others, that's a whole philosophical debate in itself.
Okay, so judging best is tricky. What else do philosophers worry about with this ABD1 rule?
Well, some think it's a bit too bold. It jumps straight to believing the best explanation is true. But maybe we should be more cautious. Maybe the best explanation, even if it's better than all the others we've thought of, maybe it's just more likely to be true. Or maybe it's just closer to the truth than the others. Inferring it's 100% true, that might be overstepping.
Yeah, it does feel like a big leap. Like, maybe it's the best we've got right now, but who knows what we'll discover later. But you also mentioned a deeper issue with ABD1, right? Something about missing the best explanation entirely.
Exactly. That's a real kicker. ABD1, it tells us to pick the best explanation from the ones we've already thought of. But what if the real, true, absolute best explanation is out there, and we haven't even considered it yet? It's like that saying, the best of a bad bunch. What if we're just picking the least bad option from a bunch of flawed explanations?
Wow, okay. That's kind of humbling. How do we know we're not missing the real answer entirely?
That's the problem. ABD1 acts like our list of possible explanations is complete, like we've thought of every possibility. But that's a big assumption. Some philosophers tried to fix this by saying, okay, let's always include the option that all our current explanations are wrong. That way, at least we're acknowledging that we might be totally off base.
I see, like a safety net. So what's wrong with that?
Well, saying none of our explanations are right, it doesn't really give us a new positive explanation. It's just a denial. And it's usually so vague, so unspecific that it's impossible to test or even understand what it would mean for it to be true. So while it technically widens our options, it doesn't really help us find a good explanation to believe in.
Okay, so ABD1 has some serious limitations.
Yeah.
What about these other versions of abduction you mentioned? The ones that try to fix these problems?
Right. The philosophers, they've been hard at work on this. One approach, we can call it ABD2, tries to deal with that bad bunch problem by saying, okay, we should only believe the best explanation if it's also good enough on its own, not just better than the alternatives. Like, it needs to pass a certain threshold of quality, regardless of what else is on the table.
I like that. Like, it can't just be the tallest dwarf. It has to be actually tall. But how do we decide what counts as good enough?
That's the tricky part. ABD2 avoids just comparing options, which is great, but now we need this independent standard for what makes an explanation good enough. And that's no easy task. Another approach, we'll call it ABD3, takes a different tack. It focuses on the idea of truth-likeness. It says that if one explanation is better than the others, then we should believe it's closer to the truth than the others.
That seems more reasonable, less absolute. Like, it's not saying we found the ultimate truth, just that we're getting warmer.
Right. ABD3 relies on this idea of closeness to the truth. And luckily, Philosophers have actually developed some pretty sophisticated theories about that. And the cool thing about this version, and others like it, is that they don't need to assume we have the absolute best explanation on our list. They're just working with what we've got.
Okay, so these newer versions of abduction, they seem a bit more philosophically sophisticated. What about psychology? Have psychologists figured out how our brains actually do this abduction thing?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. And psychologists are definitely on the case. They've been looking at what makes an explanation click for us. Like, do we prefer explanations that focus on how things work or explanations that focus on why things happen? And they've also been comparing abduction to other models of how we update our beliefs, like Bayesian models. Some studies suggest that in certain situations, we might be doing something like ABD2, where we judge an explanation on its own merits and not just against the competition. But there's no clear consensus yet on what the abduction algorithm in our brains actually looks like. And from a philosophical standpoint, the big question remains, even if we do use abduction, should we? Is it a reliable path to true beliefs?
It's amazing how something so seemingly simple can raise so many deep questions. And you mentioned some pretty serious criticisms of abduction, right? Some people think it's just plain irrational.
Yeah, abduction might be our go-to move, but it's not without its critics. Some psychologists have found that just coming up with any explanation, even a bad one, can make us more confident in a claim, even if there's no good reason to be. And it gets worse. Studies show that we tend to love simple explanations, even when the evidence points to something more complex. It's like we're drawn to neat and tidy stories, even if they're not the most accurate.
So our love for a good story might be leading us astray.
Possibly. But the most powerful philosophical punches against abduction, they come from a philosopher named Bas van Fraassen. He had a few main arguments. One was this. He said that a good explanation tells us more about the world, it's more informative. But the more informative a theory is, the more ways there are for it to be wrong. So he argued that using explanatory power to justify beliefs is a bad idea. You're basically favoring theories that are more likely to be false.
That's a pretty bold claim. What did defenders of abduction say to that?
Well, they pushed back on that whole more informative means more likely to be wrong idea. They pointed out that sometimes a more explanatory theory isn't actually giving us more ways for it to be false, it's just giving us a better understanding of what's already there. Like, think about Einstein's theory of relativity. It's considered a much better explanation than older theories, but it wasn't necessarily riskier, more likely to be wrong. It was just a more elegant, more insightful way of looking at things.
So more explanation doesn't always mean more risk.
Exactly. But Van Fraassen had another big criticism up his sleeve. This one had to do with probability. He argued that if you try to combine abduction with Bayesianism, which is a popular way of thinking about how evidence supports beliefs, you run into problems. Either you end up with something that's just basic Bayesianism, so abduction doesn't add anything new, or you end up with something that's logically messed up, and you could end up making bets that are guaranteed to make you lose money. Not a good look for a theory of reasoning.
Nobody wants to lose money on bad bets. So how did abduction fans handle that one?
They had a few comebacks. Some said, look, Bayesianism is great and all, but maybe sticking to it rigidly isn't always the best strategy. They argued that allowing a little bit of abduction into the mix, even if it makes things a bit messy from a purely Bayesian perspective, might actually help us get to the truth faster in the long run. It's like a shortcut that might sometimes lead you astray, but overall it gets you where you need to go more efficiently.
A bit of calculated risk-taking for the sake of knowledge. I like it.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the other defenses?
Others argued that we shouldn't judge abduction in isolation. They said we need to look at our whole system of beliefs and reasoning, and if that whole system hangs together logically, then a little bit of abduction here and there might be perfectly fine. And they actually came up with some pretty cool formal systems that managed to incorporate abduction without falling apart logically. So Van Fraassen's criticisms were definitely important, but they didn't completely shut down the conversation about probabilistic abduction.
Okay, so it sounds like abduction has taken some hits, but is still standing strong. So let's talk about the arguments for abduction. What are the reasons to believe this whole inference to the best explanation thing is a good idea in the first place?
Well, since it's hard to justify abduction based purely on logic, a lot of the defenses point to its success in the real world, especially in science. One of the most famous defenses comes from Richard Boyd. He basically said, look, science works, and science relies heavily on abduction. We use it all the time to come up with new theories. So the best explanation for the success of science is that those theories, the ones we got through abduction, are at least mostly true.
That's a pretty compelling argument. But isn't it a bit circular? Like using the success of science, which relies on abduction, to justify abduction.
You're sharp. That's a common criticism. It's like saying abduction works because it works. But a philosopher named Stathis Psillos jumped in to defend Boyd. He said we need to distinguish between two types of circularity. One is premise circularity, where your argument assumes the very thing it's trying to prove. That's bad. But there's also rule circularity, where the argument uses the very rule it's trying to justify. Psillos said Boyd's argument is rule circular, but not necessarily a bad kind. It's not automatically assuming abduction is reliable.
Okay, so even though the argument uses abduction, it's still possible for it to conclude that abduction is a bad idea.
Exactly. The conclusion isn't predetermined. However, even if rule circularity isn't always a deal breaker, it still makes philosophers a bit uneasy. After all, you could probably come up with a rule circular argument to justify all sorts of crazy inference rules. Psillos tried to address this by adding an extra condition, that we shouldn't already have good reasons to doubt the rule we're trying to justify. But that just kicks the can down the road. When do we have good reasons to doubt a rule? It's tricky.
Yeah, figuring out the rules of the game is never easy. What were some of the other defenses of abduction?
Another popular one appeals to good old-fashioned induction. The idea is that every time abduction leads us to a successful prediction or discovery, like finding Neptune, it's like a point in favor of abduction. It's saying, look how many times this has worked. It's probably a good bet in general.
It's like building a case file for abduction. See, Your Honor, it has a good track record.
Exactly. And a bunch of philosophers like Hooray, Bird, Kitcher, and Duvin, they've all explored this idea of using induction to defend abduction. It's a way to justify abduction without actually using abduction itself.
Clever. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on this Bayesian thing you mentioned earlier, this idea of probabilities and how we update our beliefs. How does abduction fit in with that whole framework?
Ah, yes. Bayesianism. That's a big one in contemporary philosophy. It's all about how we should adjust our beliefs when we get new evidence. And the classic Bayesian approach doesn't really talk about explanations directly. So a lot of philosophers are wrestling with this question. Can abduction be a part of Bayesianism? Or is it something totally different, maybe even a competitor? Some philosophers, especially those who love explanations, they think abduction can and should be a part of the Bayesian picture.
So how would that work? How do you mix this vast explanation idea with all the probabilities and math of Bayesianism?
Well, one idea is to use explanations to set up those initial probabilities that Bayesians use. You see, Bayes' rule, it tells you how to update your beliefs once you have those initial probabilities, but it doesn't tell you where to get them in the first place. So these explanation-loving Bayesians, they say we should give higher probabilities to hypotheses that provide better explanations. That way, they're more likely to be confirmed by the evidence later on.
But Bayesians already say you can use any prior probabilities you want as long as they're consistent. So what's new here?
That's a good point. The standard Bayesian view is pretty flexible about those initial probabilities. What these explanation folks are saying is that we should systematically use explanations to guide our initial guesses. It's like a rule of thumb. Better explanations, higher probability.
It's like adding a bit more rigor to the process.
Exactly. Another philosopher, Richard Weisberg, he even suggested that explanations can be helpful in objective Bayesianism, where you're trying to assign probabilities in a totally impartial way. And then there's the idea that explanations can be useful as a kind of heuristic, a shortcut, when we're just clueless about what probabilities to use. It's like, if we don't have any other information, we can use the best explanation as a starting point.
So explanation is a tiebreaker when the probabilities are a mystery.
Yep. But some hardcore Bayesians, they might push back and say, look, if we're that unsure, maybe Bayesianism isn't the right tool for the job anyway. Or they might say that any reasonable set of initial probabilities will eventually lead us to the truth if we keep updating them with enough evidence. And then there's Stathis Psillos again. He had this interesting idea that maybe abduction's job is to help us choose which hypotheses to test using Bayesian methods.
So abduction helps us narrow things down, and then we let Bayesianism take over.
Right. It's a division of labor. But for some people, that might not be enough. They might say that explanation should have a much bigger role, a more direct impact on our beliefs. And then there's this whole other idea that abduction and Bayesianism might be operating on different levels. Like Robert Foley, he suggested that abduction is all about what we believe, period, yes or no. While Bayesianism is about degrees of belief, how confident we are in something.
So, two different ways of thinking about belief. Maybe working together, maybe not. It's like a philosophical mystery.
Exactly. And that debate is still raging on. Philosophers are exploring all these different ways abduction and Bayesianism might interact, how they might help us get closer to the truth.
Well, this has been a wild ride. We've gone from muddy paw prints to brains in vats to the very foundations of scientific reasoning. And it all comes back to this simple question. How do we know what to believe?
It's incredible, right? Something so basic, so intuitive, and yet it opens up this whole universe of philosophical questions.
So, for all you philosophers out there listening, here's something to ponder. When you make these inferences to the best explanation, what convinces you? Is it the sheer elegance of the explanation itself? Or is it something else? Maybe it's simplicity or how well it fits with your other beliefs or whether it's testable. What makes you say, yes, this explanation is the one?
If you're ready to keep exploring this fascinating world of abduction, we highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the topic. And don't be afraid to dive into the work of all those brilliant philosophers we mentioned today. It's a journey into the heart of how we think and how we come to know what we know.